Folks, welcome inside the Parisi Palace, high above 3773's Broadway. This is a live edition of the Jake Feinberg Show. Comedy on Power Talk. Please go to our website, powertalk.live. Download our free app and stream all of our live local programming, including Solomon on Blast, the Jim Parisi Show, and yours truly, the Jake Feinberg Show. Can't thank you enough for making us part of your day today. And a cat that I have been coveting for some time. I've seen him on his own solo records and as an accompanist with some of the serious musical masters of his generation. It's an honor to invite to the program Steve Kuhn. Welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Just one thing. Yeah. Kuhn. It's pronounced Kuhn, the last name.
Steve Kuhn.
Think of the letter Q.
Let's do it again here. Steve Kuhn, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
There you go. My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Hey, can you just, from your own perspective, step back and did you play at Birdland?
The original one, yes, a number of times.
Can you talk about the first time that you played there? And honestly, like Dick Hyman played there, but it's Lester Young, but they're. I guess to the idea of saying, especially with the musicians, it was about. Could you talk about the music, the lack of monetization or monetary compensation? That was not the incentive. It was really about connecting with the gods.
Oh, there was some monetary considerations. Believe me, back in those days, nothing like it is today, but. People needed to have money to pay their bills and rent, etc. But it was always an honor to work there because that was the club and named after Charlie Parker, who was one of my heroes and the hero of many, many, many people. It was just very nice to be there, and I happened to live in a hotel a block and a half north of Birdland, the original Birdland, at that time. So I was able to go down as a listener. They knew me after a while, so they didn't charge me to get in. And then I was able to work there with different, with Stan Getz and Kenny Dorham, different people over the years. So it was quite a shrine. It was very nice, very nice.
At the time, though. What was when you talk about the master, I know financial considerations were part of it, but I don't know what hotel you were staying at, but, guys like David T. Walker were staying for months at a time at certain hotels, black hotels. The cost of living wasn't as crushing. And I just wanted you to go a little bit deeper because while Bird was a total individualist on his horn, with Miles and Dizzy and Stan, for many years, it was always about playing with the best cats, the greatest cats, and playing transcendent music. In fact, through my research, the reason Stan and Miles and those cats turned their back on the audience in some ways is because they wanted to connect with the music and transcend and not worry about whether somebody was laughing or smiling or clapping, not getting disrupted by applause. And it really... That attitude was such that that you guys were so in love with the music that if the audience liked it, great. But even if they didn't like it, you guys still dug it, and you were going to play your butts off. And I just want I'm 39. I want you to take me back. What was the idea of the music at that time, and where you wanted to take the music?
Oh goodness,
it's a deep hang.
It's hard to say. I mean, the music was the main thing, of course, and we were trying to play it as best we could and try to innovate on top of that, or extend the parameters as it were. And we were all trying to do that. Some more successful than others, but nevertheless, the music was the prime focus. And Birdland was the main venue at that time. I don't know. I don't know what more I can say.
No problem. But that was so you were in love with, you were a bebopper. I mean, you were into bebop.
Yes.
Could you talk about the drummers that you learned, because like Kluk gets all the credit, and Roy Haynes, you played with Haynes. This is what I'm getting at, is the idea of it when it went from 4 on the floor to feathering the bass drum and using rebound for accents as opposed to just pulsating that thing, because can you talk about some of the early drummers you worked with and how that lent itself to the increase in musical vocabulary?
Well, you mentioned Al Foster. Al and Ron Carter I had the privilege to work with and do some trio recordings with as well. And it was like, for me, a kid in a toy store that just sort of ran by itself. Only there was the mutual dialogue, which is very, very crucial in a small, like a trio or a quartet, just to have that musical conversation between everybody, and so there's nobody necessarily leading it. It's all about the conversation, and I learned that from Bill Evans, just listening to what he did with Scotty and Paul Motion. So thinking back, I mean, a drummer like Grady Tate, for me, was a little. It was a little hard to play with because he sort of laid it down, and I was not able to stretch the way I wanted to. I played briefly with Buhena, Art Blakey, and it was the same thing, and the same thing with Philly Joe. So Al, it just sort of loosened things up quite a bit for me, and there was the drummer Pete LaRocca also, who was quite extraordinary. And
I want you to give some credit, give some love to LaRocca, because that guy was a cab driver, wound up being a lawyer. He's the most ridiculous drummer ever. So can you talk? I also am surprised to hear you say Philly Joe was a guy that laid it down hard, but I guess
well, he laid it down in a way that for me at the time, being young and brash, I just didn't really. It was his way or the, as they say, the highway. It's just the same with Buhena, and so with LaRocca, he was flexible. I mean, he was originally a vibraphone player, and he switched over to drums when he worked with Tito Puente, I believe it was. And his name Sims, which is his last name, he changed to LaRocca at that time. And that name stuck with him, and he continued to do his thing up to the point where he said to me once, "I'm tired of making other bands sound good. Until I can work with my own group, exclusively, I'm gonna do something else." And that's when he started to drive a cab in order to make money enough to put him through law school, which he eventually did, and to his credit, but. He was quite extraordinary, extremely intelligent. He had a very high IQ, and it was really an honor to be associated with him, and with Steve Swallow also. And the three of us made a lot of music together, and that was quite nice.
I don't think I was aware. What album did you guys cut records together?
The first recording I did on my own. Of course, I can't think of the name of it. It's 1965 with LaRocca and Swallow.
Was it Three Waves?
Correct. Thank you.
Oh my God, dude, that's a trio album with LaRocca and Swallow.
Yes.
Oh my, that is mine. Okay, so here's the thing. You mentioned Bird was your hero. Bird played
one of many. Yes.
Of course. Bird would play with people in the street. Okay, like what I'm trying to get at is this idea of making authentic love on the bandstand. Like I know you wanted to pay your bills, but at 39, the greed factor is so out of control today. I'm trying to get this understanding of how you guys approached making the music. Before we get too deep in the weeds, I just want to viscerally that those cats were accessible. They crossed color lines. Really what I've come to determine is that the critics really forced these divides, but the musicians like yourself had no issues with this stuff. It was really about love. I just want you to riff on that.
No, that's not true. The color line was not there when I started, and I was able to work with Kenny Dorm. I was the only white musician in the group. With Coltrane, I was the only white musician, and a couple of other people too I worked with. But then after I guess it was 1965, and all the stuff happened with the assassinations and the everything going sort of upside down in a way, but in an attempt to get some equality, I noticed a difference. And to this day, I'm not fully aware of it, but because I do my own thing when I can, and that's it. But I know there are a lot of young white musicians who are comparable, certainly, to the African American musicians, and they just don't get the chance to play because of the innate prejudice against it, and they just the black musician would rather hire a black side person to, even though there's a white comparable or even better. So it's a shame. But back in the day, we used to have jam sessions at lofts in Manhattan, and everybody would come there and meet new people, and there was no color line whatsoever. It was really quite extraordinary. But after the mid-'60s, things changed. And I was living in Sweden between 67 and 71, and I noticed as groups would come over and sometimes would perform in Stockholm and in different places in Europe where I happened to be, I noticed a difference. I felt a difference, whereas before I would get warm hugs from people and vice versa. There was somewhat standoffish, and it was very disturbing to me, but I could understand. But nevertheless, I hadn't changed, and I was the same, and I was hoping they would feel the same towards me, but in some cases that was not the case. So.
You're pointing to the assassination of Dr. King, Robert Kennedy.
Yeah.
So okay, I want to be clear. Like in this documentary, I found this album, Stan Getz and Bill Evans, with the rhythm section of Tommy Flanagan, Elvin, and Ron C. And this is 1963. The album was cut. It actually wasn't released till 10 years later, but it was made in 63. This is prior. So right around the time that you started to collaborate with him and Brooke Meyer and Lorindo Almeida and those guys. But this is from a downbeat writer, okay? And he goes, there's two tracks in jazz from the saxophone. It's this beautiful melodic sequencing of Stan Getz, the beautiful sound of Stan, and the angry message music of Archie Shepp and John Coltrane.
Yeah.
All right, now that was now. So my question is this: really,
look to the source, look to the writer. I disagree with that.
Absolutely, but even when I talk to African American musicians, and I'm not trying to get into a right or wrong thing here. What I want to know is, how did you wind up in John Coltrane's band?
I was working with Kenny Dorm at the time. I had just come to New York in the fall of '59, and I got a job, amazingly, with Kenny. He was looking for a piano player, and through connections and people I had met while I was in high school and in college. In any case, I called everybody I knew. Kenny gave me a job, and then I heard that John was wanting to form his own quartet and leave Miles. And out of the blue, I got his number and called him. I said, I know you don't know who I am. I'm currently working with Kenny Dorm, but I would love it if we could get together and just maybe play a little, talk about the music, and maybe there's some chance that we could hook up. And he didn't say yay or nay. A couple of weeks later, he called me, and he had rented a little rehearsal studio about a block and a half from my hotel, and we met there in a tiny room with an upright piano and played some of his music and talked, and that was it for then, and didn't hear anything until he called me maybe a week later and said, I'd like you to come out to my house in Hollis, Queens for dinner. So I took the subway out there. He picked me up with the train, and we had a lovely dinner that Naima made, and we played a little more and talked, and he drove me back to Manhattan to the hotel and said nothing And then maybe a week or so later, he called and said, I'll never forget the words, would $125 a week be okay to start? And in
You're
those
like,
days,
absolutely, man.
I was making 100 a week with Kenny Dorham. So, I mean, that wouldn't be the reason necessarily. So he had a job at the Jazz Gallery in downtown Manhattan, the Lower East Side. He was hired, I think, for 4 weeks initially, and then they kept extending it 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. He was there a total of 26 weeks in a row, which is unheard of these days.
Wow.
A half a year playing in the same place, 6 nights a week. And I was privileged to work with him for about two of those months. And then McCoy kind of joined the band. And later I found out that McCoy was his first choice, but McCoy was contractually bound to the Jazz Tet at the time, and he couldn't get free until that particular time, 2 months after I was there. But those 8 weeks or so there, 6 nights a week, was just an incredible education, and just to be experiencing the absolute joy of the audience. It would be like a meeting, a church meeting. There after his solos, they would literally stand up, give him standing ovations in the middle of the song, more often than not, and it was quite exciting. Pete LaRocca was the drummer, and John's had a cousin, Steve Davis, who was the bass player from Philadelphia, and that's the way it went for me. So it was an experience that I'll never forget, and I was still trying to find my own voice, and I asked him at some point, because I was not really happy with my own playing. I said, if there's something I'm doing that you don't like, or there's something that you'd like me to do that I'm not doing, and again, I remember his words were, I respect you too much as a musician to tell you how to play. And
wow.
that was as far as it got.
Unbelievable. But, Steve Kuhn, just, I mean, you're making me cry right now. I mean, what did you... I want to read you this quote. I've done 2 interviews with Julian Priester, and I want you to relate this to Dorham and Train. Okay, he said, if you're not secure in your own ability to keep time for yourself, you have a large problem, because you cannot perform in a group where the rhythm is so hidden. The measurement or time and space has to be personal. You're freeing up the rhythm section to play music, not to accompany the horns that are playing music. You loosen the restrictions on all the instruments who are keeping time. You don't necessarily have to mark time. You can play in time without actually marking it. And he goes on to talk about his introduction to free music with Sun Ra. Was your introduction to free music, not avant-garde, but free, where you had to have your own internal rhythm with Train and Kenny?
Well, free music is my definition of that is you don't get paid for it. Free music is
that's Dexter Gordon's line. I don't play free music. I don't. I play music.
Yeah, well, didn't know that, but I first experienced so-called free music when I had graduated from college in the summer of '59. I was given a scholarship to the Lenox School of Jazz up in Massachusetts, western part.
Wow.
And Ornette and Don Cherry were students as well as I. And I was put with that group.
Oh, my God.
It was the sextet.
Unbelievable.
That's the first experience I had. And my initial, John Lewis and Max Roach were the 2 instructors in this particular group, and I remember John, because I didn't quite know what to do when Ornette or Don were soloing, Don Cherry, because there was no harmony necessarily, there was no rhythm. So John Lewis said, just sort of do what I do with the MJQ, is just sort of play behind Milt, play a little with counterpoint behind Milt, and no, he doesn't chord or anything. And I tried that, and I didn't like that, so I wound up just laying out when they soloed. And when it came time for me to solo, I would do whatever I did. And but that was really the first exposure I had to quote-unquote free music, which really was. It was.
I didn't mean to get... I'm sorry because I hate labels. It's all music. I meant... in not relying on the rhythm section to keep time. Can you talk about that evolution in your career where you didn't have to mark the time? It was internal because Sun Ra used to, with Julian on the bandstand back in the mid 50s, he would just point to somebody to solo and they would just have to have their own internal time. They were not, and that freed up the rhythm sections, the ones the LaRocas and the Elvins that are, to play the tune and not just play time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, of course you have to have the internal time, and I believe I had that, and I tried stretching the parameters as much as I could, depending upon the people I was working with. But with Kenny, it was a little more traditional, because his drummers, for the most part, were pretty traditional drummers, and they didn't stretch the parameters particularly much. He had a wonderful bassist named Butch Warren, but the drums, in terms of a group feeling, the drums, in my view, are the most important determining factor in the feeling of the group. If the drums are happening, then it's wonderful, and if it's not, well, you feel some tension there. It's horrible, and I encountered that pro and con, throughout the beginning years with different groups I worked with. With Coltrane, it was LaRocca, and that was very easy. I worked with Art Farmer for a year with Steve Swallow and Pete LaRocca, and that was very easy as well because it was LaRocca. And gradually, shortly after that, I went to live in Europe and with my own trio. But the drums really determining to me that the strongest. They can change a feeling of a group just on the right on the spur of the moment. Frankly,
I also want you to know, Mr. Kuhn, just keep coughing away. I can edit all the coughs out. I want you to get a clear voice. You mentioned Max, and who was the other teacher? Oh, John Lewis.
John Lewis.
But
see, I played with Max too, and Max, for me, was a wonderful soloist. Playing with him it's his way or the highway. I didn't really enjoy playing with him, but I loved to listen to him in group context that he was comfortable in, and plus his solo work was extraordinary.
Can you just when you you used a kind of a inside musical term, like you laid out. You didn't feel comfortable sort of playing counterpoint, so you just laid out and
or comping. Yeah,
comping. You weren't, and so because those guys there were no bar lines, right? I mean, how did you do that? And how did you do that? Did you go to the Catskills and play in those? How did you work that out and get that out of your system in a live setting?
Well, a lot of what they did had to do with the melodic ideas, and they expanded on that. Excuse me. And that's what I did when I soloed. But when I didn't want to comp or play behind them in any way, because I thought that would interfere with what they were doing. So that's essentially what I did. I did not play until it came time for me to solo. And whether they thought I was being arrogant or whatever, but I thought that worked the best. And it gave them the absolute freedom to come and go wherever they wanted.
And would you say that it was again, we don't like to use terms here, but Ornette he was still a student, so he was not yet an established professional at that point.
No, but he very shortly became that. He just was up at this school for 3 weeks. We were there, and then he came to New York, and they got him a job at the 5 Spot, and he was there for quite a while, and he became who he was very, very quickly.
Talking to Steve Kuhn here on the Jake Feinberg Show. The legacy of, the faculty up there was Bill Evans and George Russell and Gunther Schuller.
Correct.
Is it too simplistic to say that they were merging melodic improvisation, jazz, rhythm and blues, and classical music? Can you talk about what it was in their compositions that had the most profound? Let's just take George Russell. That dude was sonically expanding. it was some of the stuff he's doing. It was just the sonic expansion was emboldening. So can you talk about how, for instance, George impacted your own look on how to compose and arrange?
Frankly, not at all. He the main thing was this Lydian concept of improvisation, which he went into the mode and was improvising in mode or modes. I learned what the modes were in school, and frankly, I didn't want to deliberately say, well, I'm going to improvise in the Aeolian or the Mixolydian or whatever. Art Farmer, however, was a very strong devotee of George's, and if you listen to his improvisation, you can hear the modes. I just sort of, it came natural to me, and so I never thought about I'm in this mode or that mode. And as far as George's influence on me, I think I went through his course and I studied with him and we talked, but I don't think it really had any impact at all.
When it came down to when you became a leader, though, when you looking back on it, who was the person that had the most impact, if anyone, on your compositions and how you arranged them?
Compositions? Oh Lord, I don't know. I just composing has always been difficult for me. I have to sit at the piano and with a blank piece of paper in front of me and just sort of figure out, well, what kind of a song is it going to be? Fast, slow, medium, what time signature, and so on. And then go into that and write a little bit, erase it or keep it and go on from there. And it's always been difficult for me to write. I finally, after recording everything that was in my repertoire, which included one or two originals, I think. The rest were just standard songs, other people's songs that I had sort of played the way I play them, but I recorded everything. And I'll never forget, Steve, we were in Paris. We did this recording, and Swallow said to me, "You've got to write. You've got to write." And the woman I was living with in Sweden at the time, she was there, and so both of them got on my case. And that summer, I started to write. I went out to the piano in Stockholm, and then out, and she had a beautiful house, a beautiful yard, and I just sat out there and continued to write. And I wrote lyrics, Stream of Consciousness, a lot of them were. But I wrote maybe 13 songs in a period of maybe 3 months, which was incredible for me. And ever since then, I've tried to continue to write, but I've been dry in that respect for maybe a decade now. I just haven't felt like it. So a lot of the recordings I've been doing have been reinterpretations of songs that I did years ago on the newer recordings that I've done. But I think it still has my imprimatur on it. So that's hopefully that's the case.
When you talk about stream of consciousness, is that going back to your favorite drummers? Is that what you loved about them too? That they weren't that they would just go with the feel, and that basically you could create a theme or inflect, and they would go with that, as opposed to just playing what they wanted to play?
Well, they would go. They would do stuff too that I would react to. Absolutely, Al Foster was a prime example of that. I mean, he had his cymbals, depending upon which ones he was using and what the context was. His cymbals sounded, like real notes. They were real notes of the orchestra, and so he would be doing something rhythmic on the cymbals, and I would pick up on it and do a little something off of that, and it would just go on and around with the bass and the drums. It was, as I said about the conversation, I think I learned from Ahmad Jamal's quartet, or trio, rather, the one at the Pershing Hotel.
Sure.
And of course, with Bill Evans, who had that conversation with the trio, that what it was about. And I, to this day, feel that's the most important thing, is to have that musical conversation with whomever you're playing, even though the musicians I work with now are 20, 30 years younger than I am. Still, they know the history of the music, and they understand the call and response, and so it works out okay. But it's not. It's different, of course, than what it was back then.
Mark Levine told me a story about going to. Well, he didn't go to Berkeley. He just hung out there, and then eventually weaseled his way into Jackie Byard's studio for a lesson. And the lesson was basic. And Byard was known as a piano player, but he could play drums really well. And
he played saxophone, tenor saxophone also.
Obviously, the guy was brilliant. And he'd say to Mark, sit down and play Cherokee in every key.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And Mark would fall apart at, somewhere G or something like that. And Jackie would say, okay, that's enough for today. You know what your homework is, and I'll see you next week. And then I've done 2 interviews with Charles Neville, one of the Neville brothers, who has spent a lot of time in New York when you were there. And he said that Sonny Stitt told me years ago, man, you got to know your horn. I said, what do you mean I have to know my horn? He said, you've got to learn all the scales. I told him, I don't want to play no scales. I just want to play bebop. He said, look, the instrument is constructed based on scales. There's nothing that you play that doesn't come from a scale. How can you get to play in any key? You learn all the scales. A scale's like a cube. It's got 6 sides. That's one side of that cube. When you learn the scale up and down, the cube is filled with a bunch of smaller cubes, et cetera, et cetera. So with Coltrane, what I'm saying is cats can copy records. A lot of, you can transcribe things off Sonny Stitt or Elvin Jones. But then on the bandstand, once you run through all those licks, if you don't have your own bag, that's all you got. And I'm just trying to figure out how you learned. Was there a point when you learned how it unlocked your ears to be able to play any song in any key? And if you, in those loft sessions or jam sessions, if that's stuff that you worked on?
Not to a great extent, but to some extent. But I was blessed with absolute pitch, and I was able to. I didn't have to transcribe any. If there was a particular part of somebody's solo that I liked, I could hear it and I could play it. But eventually, got tired of that and realized I just have to play me and what's coming from me. And since then, of course, I've always tried to do that. But the influences, my goodness, from Art Tatum, who was God to me, through Bird and Basie and Ellington and John and Miles. But I think probably after Bill, because when the first time I heard Bill play, it was, I said, my God, the direction I want to go in is what he's doing. And it sort of took me aback until I was able to just reconnoiter in a way and, just gather my thoughts and just try to play me. But Bill was definitely an influence in terms of the way he thought of the trio, and the fact that he had a great amount of technique on the piano, but you never knew that because he never played, for example, the way Oscar Peterson played, who was an incredible technician, but never touched my heart the way Bill did.
Wow.
And Bill was able to just evoke those deep emotions. Less is more, and I learned that, listening to Ahmad and to Bill and Miles, of course. And Coltrane, despite the fact that he's known for playing zillions of notes, he grew up in the rhythm and blues bands. He could play ballads. I mean, he was extremely heartfelt in his playing, regardless of what it was. He could play few notes or a lot of notes, but where he was coming from. You mentioned Sonny Stitt. I don't consider him any kind of an innovator whatsoever. He was a bird guy, and he did a lot of stuff that Bird did, and he did it very well. But I never really heard him per se.
Interesting. Do you feel like? I mean, Joe Sample told me, rest in peace. He's like, it's insanity, the pressure that Stitt, or at least he was billed as the next Charlie Parker, and Sample's like, how the heck can you possibly do that? Yeah. Why would you want to do that?
You can't.
So I think he got sucked under that pressure. I want you to talk. So this idea of the infinite void, and this idea of, spaces, the space in the music. Are you, because when I interviewed Eddie Henderson the other day, he was talking about the M1 band they borrowed from Bitches Brew, and they borrowed from Coltrane different things, but he talked about Miles and that the infinite void, that space. But would you say when you first saw, and I'm going back to the birth of the cool jazz, the trio, the first time that you saw that trio with Scotty LaFaro, Paul Motion, I mean, Bill was not playing, he wasn't demonstrating huge facility, but what was he doing with the trio that was so energizing to you?
The conversation and the fact that he had, Scotty was absolutely extraordinary. There has not been a bassist come along since then, nor will there ever. Scotty was Scotty. And, the relationship they had, and Paul was very, very good. It was about the conversation, and there was no need to fill up all the spaces. Let the music breathe. You don't need to play every beat of every measure. It's not necessary. You don't. When you're talking, you talk to somebody in person. You don't. For the most part, people don't do that. You leave space. You have to breathe, catch your breath, whatever. And that's the same with the music. Just let the music breathe. And that's what Bill did, certainly, with the trio, and what Ahmad did with his group. And Miles did as well. Miles, was extraordinary. He just left a lot of space. But you didn't miss anything, because what he played was absolute genius. So.
I want to put in a piece of music here for you. We're talking to a decorated pianist, a leader, and a sideman for many, many years. A cat who has been there since the beginnings of, in some ways, the beginnings of modern music, modern jazz. So let's take a listen to this, and then we'll come back and talk about it. All right, Mr. Kuhn, what do you got for us, brother?
Say again?
What do you think that is?
At first, I didn't know.
I know.
That was done in 1960 or 61, I guess.
That's right.
Or was it 63? I don't know.
No, you're spot. That's Minuet Circa. 1961.
61. Yeah.
Steve Kuhn burning on the acoustic piano. That's what we let in with. And then the deluge of language and conversation between Getz and Brookmeyer and you and Haynes. This. Can you just talk about how you connected originally with Stan Getz?
It was through Scott LaFaro. Stan was living in Europe, I guess either in Stockholm or Copenhagen, I don't know. And he had married Monica, I guess, and decided, he was in exile, let's say, and then he decided he wanted to come back and work in the States. So he came back with Monica and was in touch with Scotty in California, and he asked if Scotty would be interested in joining his group. And Scotty was working with Bill at the time, but Bill wasn't working a great deal. So Scotty said, well, I'd be interested, but only if I could have the rhythm section I wanted. And he said Pete LaRocca and me.
Roy Haynes.
No, Pete LaRocca.
LaRocca was the. So I'm sorry. It was Pete LaRocca, and I'm sorry. Who was the bass player?
Scotty. LaFaro.
Yeah, he said. So who did he want? He wanted Kuhn, and he wanted
LaRocca.
LaRocca. Wow.
So we met one afternoon at the Village Vanguard to just play together and see, and we played a tune or two, and Scott said, and Stan said, "Fine, this is it. Well, you're hired." And the first job we had was in Chicago at the Sutherland Lounge on the south side of Chicago. And we were there for 2 weeks. And at the end of the 2 weeks, Scotty, being Scotty, went up to Stan and said, I don't want to stay in this group anymore. I'm having problems with the drums. And all he heard from Pete was the cymbals. He didn't hear the drums per se. He wanted to hear more of the drums, and in combination with the cymbals. So Stan said, well, who do you want? And Scott said, well, how about Roy Haynes? So that's after 2 weeks, Pete was gone, and Roy Haynes came on the band, and that was the group intact until Scott lost his life tragically that summer up in New York State. So that's how that group got started. And then after another 6-8 months, the bassist became John Neves. He was with us maybe 4 or 5 months. Roy Haynes, John Neves, and myself, and he used to feature the trio every set we did, a couple of tunes. And he at some point turned around to me and said, this band has to disband, because he felt as though the trio was outshining him, Stan being paranoid as he was. And so he broke the band up. And about 8 months later, he called me and said he'd like me to hook up again with him. And he had Tommy Williams, the bass player, and Al Harewood was the drummer. And that's the way it went for maybe a year until I left and went with Art Farmer. But that's pretty much the background.
How did Brookmeyer figure into this thing?
It may have I think he had worked with Stan in a quintet context around that time or before that time, and he respected Brookmeyer's ability as a musician, as a writer, arranger, composer, and so he wanted to do this recording with Brookmeyer. We originally did a quartet recording in Chicago the second week with Pete and Scotty and myself, and Stan was not pleased with his own playing, so he didn't want the thing to come out. It may have come out since, I don't know, somebody sent me a cassette, so I suspect it came out somewhere. But
this is very important. This was the quartet. This was you, LaRocca,
Scotty, and Stan.
And you guys were on that South Side gig, or was this another gig in Chicago?
No, this was during that South Side job.
And you have an analog cassette of that tape, of that gig?
I have a cassette, yes, somewhere. Somewhere.
Also, I'm just trying to get the chronology here. Had you already played with Train yet, or not yet?
Yeah, this was after Coltrane.
So what year, that was my question with Train, was he doing the My Favorite Things at that point when you met him, or where was he at in his evolution?
He was doing some of that, and then some of the stuff that was harmonically very sparse, like one or two, like the song So What, or whatever he called it, Impressions. And he was stretching out, at that point. So he was doing both, the My Favorite Things kind of thing, plus more advanced in terms of lack of harmony and just stretching out, which he continued to do certainly after I left, and then which he continued to do up until he passed.
Was he doing like some situations where it would just be you and him to start the show, or just him and LaRocca would duke it out for 30 minutes? Because I know, like, once that quote unquote the quartet came in, it would be him and Elvin would just go at it, or or McCoy. I mean, did you have those kind of fun loving?
No.
It was just a traditional sort of start the tune.
Pretty much so. Yes.
And that year was 1959, or so. When did you actually hang with him and Naima and those cats when you got the gig?
The first part of '60, January, February '60.
Going back to Stan, this is a Jekyll and Hyde character. I've done 4 dozen interviews on this guy, and I just want you to give an unvarnished personal description of Stan, because while he was brilliant on the bandstand, especially when he was in the alpha state, he also was a jaded character. And I just want to being that you knew him, he was in Denmark at the time. he was jonesing, literally, pardon the pun, to get back to the New York jazz scene. And then you guys connected, and he made that album Focus with Joe Navis and Roy Haynes, and it was and Eddie Sauter. And so tell me about Stan, the Jekyll and Hyde personality of Stan Getz.
Oh, that would take too long for the time.
Well, I mean, just a few anecdotal things would be wonderful.
Well, he did the album Focus, which was quite lovely. It was quite a. He was he needed to have the background was pre-recorded, and he just soloed over it. He couldn't do it. They all couldn't go in the studio at the same time. I remember he was nervous about that, so he had all the background stuff pre-recorded, and he went in overdubbed his solos, and but it came out very well, and nobody knows that necessarily. So, but then he would joke about the album. He said we're playing someplace, and he'd say to the audience, "You know what focus spelled backwards is," and then there'd be a pause, and then it's suck off. So I mean, stuff like that. His intent was somewhat just in doubt in terms of where he was at. But he was very, very insecure. He had substance abuse problems from the time in his teens, and it stayed with him in terms of alcohol and drugs. And depending upon what state he was in, it would depend how he acted. I mean, he would be very arrogant at times, but his playing, he said, he always referred to himself as the Jewish Lester Young, and that's. I mean, if you listen to his playing, that's not far from the truth. He was a wonderful melodic player, in my mind, not an innovator, but an extraordinary melodic player, and he could play up tempos very well. He had a lot of technique. But he also had this other side of his personality. When you talk about Stan Getz, I said, I would say, which one? Which? Well,
that was the famous Zoot Sims line. How many?
Yeah.
Stan was a nice bunch of guys, or he was a bunch of nice guys. But I mean, you're telling me that used the word paranoid because he felt that the trio was getting the better of him. Did you
at that point?
But I mean, was he was probably playing his butt off? I mean, what was it about?
Yeah.
Why was there? I mean, this nexus though. This is, and I'm not saying. I mean, have you ever done any drugs in your life?
I've tried everything pretty much.
Okay.
But I stopped in the mid '60s and have not been near anything since then.
So I mean, because like David Amram never did any drugs. And yet, there are stories. I mean, Bill Crow is telling me stories about Stan, ODing at a party somewhere, and then they bring him back to life. They resuscitate him, and he goes, what's going on? They're like, Stan, you're dead. He's like, yeah, but I was higher than you, And it's like it was like this sort of callous. How much of that nexus of at the time, even though you were experimenting and eventually dropped it all, can you just talk about that nexus, that intersection of genius and addiction, and ultimately how a lot of cats like Stan thought that in order to play really transcendent music, they needed to be out of their minds?
Well, he was insecure when he first started to play. He was studied with whomever, I can't remember, and then he went on Woody's band. And he never really had the self-confidence, and he did that solo on early Autumn, which really catapulted him out of and made him very much in demand, and he was able to work on his own pretty much after that. But his foundation was insecurity. He never really felt secure within himself, and that's generally the reason why. I mean, you can experiment with drugs, but at some point, you're going to either get off of it completely or you're going to be hooked. And he had that personality, and he was hooked for the for his life, off and on, off and on, off and on, and was played his ass off, but he was very insecure. I remember we did at the Jazz Gallery after I was with Coltrane. I don't know, maybe a year later. It was a double bill with him and Coltrane, and I was with Stan. And he had a hell of a week there because he felt so inferior to Coltrane, and he would say to me often, "You'd much rather be up there with him than with me." And I mean, the truth of the matter is yes, but of course I wouldn't say that. But he, on his own, Stan was extraordinary in terms of being able to improvise and play in tune, and he had his own way. And when you when you hear his music, you know it's Stan, just the way it is with Coltrane. But he was very, very insecure and never really was comfortable in his own skin, and therefore did what he did.
Just for the record, he was in ninth grade. He was on the road with Jack Teagarden, with guys that were actually sort of scab musicians, because the really good ones went off to the World War, and they were asking him to have sex with women that had syphilis, and he was drinking his, I mean, he got tortured. He was a tortured, I mean, you said something interesting though, because someone like Train Don Menza said, he overheard Train at Newport Jazz Festival say it, and it's a classic line. If we could all sound like Stan Getz, we would. But you say he was not an innovator.
No, I don't think so.
So you don't. How do you talk about what his contribution was to the girl from Ipanema? Was it just? I mean, that I know that João Gilberto was the one that came up with the 2-beat rhythm. You had Astrid singing the lyrics, which was intoxicating, but that knocked the Beatles off the pop charts. Mm-hmm. And I'm just trying to figure out what your point, where you were at, like what you viewed that as. Was it just timing? But you're saying he never in his career was he an innovator.
I don't think so, no. But he extended the Lester Young lyricism, got his own sound on the horn, which you could readily identify any time, and that's quite extraordinary in and of itself. But in terms of stretching the parameters of the music the way Coltrane did, or Miles, or Bird, no, I don't think so. But he was an extraordinary player. I mean, I don't know what else I can say.
No, absolutely. I mean, Creed Taylor said that in those focus sessions he came with a bunch of barbiturates and a bottle of whiskey. Can you talk about how you were in the studio with him for that track we played with Brookmeyer and Haynes, and then also with Lorindo Almeida. Can you talk about his behavior in a studio setting? Because he was, I mean, cats like Jane Getz, no relation, said that she never, on the live context, she never saw somebody so absolutely inebriated play absolutely perfectly. And I'm just curious about your experiences with Stan in the studio and that sort of, that Jekyll and Hyde character, if it came out at that time.
Not especially, no. I never really got into it. He did what he did, and we did what we did, and that was it. No, I never experienced.
But you said which guy's showing up tonight? So I mean, can you talk about a time when because Richie Byrack would say, 1 minute he'd be a total asshole, and then the next minute he'd be taking your whole family out for dinner. I mean, can you talk about some of that erraticism that personally?
Oh, Lord. We were out in California when Scotty was in the band, and I guess it was Roy, Scotty, and myself, and we were having dinner before we played wherever the club was. I can't remember, maybe San Francisco, I can't remember. Maybe Todd's place. We're having dinner, and we had played maybe a night or two prior to that, and Stan was sort of paranoid about the fact that at times Scotty was not laying down the time the way he would like. Scotty would double the melody that Stan was playing of the song, and Stan got very paranoid. He said, "I know the melody, you don't have to do it," and he got very heated. He had probably had a few drinks or whatever, and he stood up at the table and had his arm cocked as if he were going to hit Scotty, and I sort of pulled him back, and they never connected, or he never connected with Scotty. But that kind of behavior, I mean, that's really paranoid. Scott played the way he did and was extraordinary, and so if he felt like playing the melody, so what? Nobody else was doing it, and that's just the way Scott was. So I remember that vividly.
Wow. So I mean that really just came from deep insecurity, because nobody in the audience picked up. It was just him feeling like, even though Scotty wasn't trying to be a hot dog, right? He wasn't trying to be a show.
No, absolutely not. No, it was just natural for Scott to do what he did, and nobody else did it that way at that time. So it was, fortunately, it didn't get to fisticuffs, but it was very close.
Do you? My favorite Kuhn albums are the ones that are. Can you just talk about your concept of recording live as opposed to in the studio? The stuff you did on Cobblestone with Ditmas and with, I think it was Mraz maybe, and Sue Evans. I mean, this is burning stuff, but it's alive. Can you just talk about kind of who, if you had been prior to you? I mean, you said you went with Stan to Chicago, and one of those there was recorded and never released. But who hipped you, or why did you get into the idea of recording live?
Because of the audience, just to have the energy from the audience as part of the music, I thought was quite different than playing in a studio where if you make a mistake or something, you stop and go, let's go back and do it from the beginning, or do it from here, and so on. So you can splice and so forth. Live recording, you're not going to start and stop and start and stop. Occasionally you do, and if you're just starting the song and something happens. But for the most part, you start it and you go right to the end, and it's a challenge. But you also get that audience energy, which you cannot get in the studio unless you do invite any number of people into the studio, which happens as well, to sit there while you're recording. But for a live audience, it's quite different. It's in number, and it's very special. So I enjoy doing both. But it's a different mindset for each.
The mindset is that there's really not a lot of time to think in the live setting. You're just hitting it, right?
Yeah. The closest thing to both, a combination of both, I've done the last two recordings. I've done one. We just did one a couple of months ago, and the one prior to that, we were at Birdland that week for 5 nights, and on the 4th day, on that Friday afternoon, we went into the studio to record, and we had been playing 3 nights in a row, and then we went in the afternoon of the 4th day to record, and so you got some of the hangover, let's say, from the first 3 nights, and we did, both albums, both CDs were done in 3 hours, which astonished the people that it could be done so quickly, but it worked out, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that we were playing for 3 nights in a row, playing, some of the repertoire, of course, and that we did on the recording. So that's sort of midway, doing it. But there is, from just recording studio-wise or live audience, there is quite a difference.
One final question for you in this set one here with Steve Kuhn. But I got to tell you, you are, I mean, it's such a delight to connect with you. My spiritual guru is somebody that his name is Tasiji Munoz. He gave me my spirit name, which is Sem Lodro, which means wisdom of the spirit of mind. And I'm looking here.
Tasiji, yeah.
How did you How did you find Tasiji? Because you guys did this thing called Incomprehensibly Gone on his record label, and I'm just wondering. I'm like, wow.
Kuhn. No, it was Bob Moses.
No, Rockalam.
Rack of Lamb.
Yeah. Rack of Lamb.
That's what I call him.
So when did you first? I want to know about The first, you must have known Rockalon back in the day. He was doing.
Well, he worked with me. Bob Moses. He worked with me for a couple of years. Did some recordings together with the trio quartet. Yeah, I've known him a long time, and he's the one who hooked us up.
And what did you feel about? I mean, tell me a little bit about CG as a. I mean, he's for some people he's a teacher, somebody who helps people with their mind. A lot of the cats go to him for that. But as far as his playing, what stood out to you?
I can't recall, frankly.
Good.
I thought of him as, frankly, what Moses did, and to stop using getting high all the time. CG was instrumental in getting him off of that, and I thought that was extraordinary that he could do that, and I respected him a great deal for that. And so musically, whatever happened. I don't recall, anything more than that.
But you were inspired by the fact that he got Rack of Lamb on the road to sobriety. Is that
yes, he certainly did. Yes.